Our second speaker this morning is Robyn Miller. Robyn has many years of experience as a social worker and family therapist, and she's also currently the Acting Director of the Office of Professional Practice, Child Protection and Youth Justice, yes it is a tongue twister, at DHS. And Robyn will be speaking to us today with a presentation with regard to young people and the impact also of family homelessness and trauma. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land and to pay my respect to elders past and any elders who are present. And I also want to congratulate the organisers of the conference, the Council and Jenny Smith, on a fantastic program. And it's lovely for me to be here. My first position in social work was working the Brotherhood and with homeless people, so I feel like literally coming home. So in that journey over 30-something years, I've found myself in the last 7 years working within the department in this role of practice leadership. And it's been a time of enormous change and reform. And that whole focus on young people transitioning out of home care is something that I'll be speaking about this morning. Hands up if you work with children. Fantastic. Hands up if you're working with young people transitioning from care or who are early into the homelessness sector. A lot of you. So I'm amongst friends. Can I just acknowledge your experience and the importance of what you do? I just take my hat off to you, and I think the quality of your relationships with young people and the commitment and the hanging in there that you do and the creative options that you come up with when it doesn't feel like there's much you can offer, I think go to an enormous way to making a difference. And you could all be writing books if you put together the case studies and the experience that you have. So I think I'll be reflecting back a lot of what you already know this morning, but hopefully sort of summarising some of the research. Not sure. Oh yes, we had new legislation in 2005 in Victoria, the Children, Youth and Families Act, and it was a big watershed because for the first time in legislation, and it became active in 2007, the word stability was in the Act, and also a focus on child development was in the Act. Prior to that, there'd been a big focus on safety, but what we had was a much more holistic understanding of what children and families need in order to be healthy and develop well. It was a very important process of consultation and partnership across the sectors: family support, out-of-home care, family violence, Aboriginal agencies. There was a huge consultation and a huge amount of effort put into the process, the relationships between parts of the system. And I think that bore great fruit, and we're seeing that today. There was the softening of the boundaries, if you like, between child protection and family services, and co-located community-based child protection workers with Child First. You all know what Child First is? It's that joined up, we have 21 areas in the state, and we have integrated family services with a joined up intake and a proactive mandate to outreach to vulnerable families rather than waiting for people to make an appointment, because we know our most disadvantaged families are often feeling so overwhelmed they won't be able to do that. So we wanted to make it less stigmatising and more family-centred, and hence this little diagram here symbolises what we developed as a team, as a system. This one model that's called the best interest case practice model, and that joins up, it's a common language across the three sectors. And that, I think, has been a very important thing, because we stood together and said, this is the way we want to practice. We want child-focused, family-centred. We want to be on about early intervention. We want to be on about proactive support that's trauma-informed. We want to integrate the knowledge from research and to practice in ways that are strength-based. So that was, I think, a really important thing. When we look at the... oh, there you go, it's clever, isn't it? I didn't do that. The whole notion of making it circular was that, you know, we have to give up this idea that you do your assessment, you form a view, you're right, and then we intervene and then we measure the outcomes. We all know working with families is not like that. What we do know is it's circular, it's messy, it's multi-layered, and you try this, that didn't work so well, we try something else. And that we have to give up ego. The moment you think you know what's right or what the truth is, you close your mind to new information that emerges. So it's very much a systemic ecological model that says we need to remain open to what we don't know and then factor that in and work together. So the whole looking after children framework, which some of you will be familiar with in the out-of-home care sector, was incorporated into this model. And what we have been committed to is actually a stronger connecting kids to kinship care, to family, to identity. And you can see here, this is just a quick snapshot of the proportion of children by the length of time in out-of-home care, and the sorts of placements that we have for them. That there's been a big shift to kinship care. So you can see that that's grown from 26 to 46%. That's a big shift over that decade. I'm giving you the broad context here, just so you've got a sense of who are the children in out-of-home care now. In Victoria, we actually have the lowest rate per 1,000 children in the population of removing children from their families to take them into out-of-home care. And I actually think that's a really good thing. We're about 5.1 per 1,000 currently. All these figures are publicly available. New South Wales is more than double. At one point it was almost triple our rate. So the important thing that we're doing is much more assertive outreach and family support earlier, I think. And that notion of when children come into care, that we need to be thinking much more therapeutically about what are their needs. These children are often coming in from a war zone. The ubiquitous nature of family violence is horrific, and we have a reasonably robust, some would say adversarial system in the children's court, and we are not taking the worried well to court. The children who come into out-of-home care in Victoria have at least 6 or 7 determinants of disadvantage. So we know then, I'm going to jump now to the leaving care because that's the area of interest and the topic for today. The Cummins report, as some of you will be aware, was released last year, 2012. And the analysis to inform that report on the children leaving care, I've just summarised very briefly for you here. We know for our Aboriginal young people, over 10 times overrepresented in our system. We know those kids leaving care, and there's about 400 each year, are roughly a third from foster care, kinship and resi care. 65%, I think this is interesting and not often well known, had their first episode of care after 12 years of age. And there's a real peak around that 14 years of age. And 50% had been in care for more than 2 years. 52% of young people exiting residential care had 2 or more instances of care, and unsurprisingly, there was more instability for those kids. But the overwhelming finding was that there's a significant proportion of these young people had significantly below average educational levels. So it was music to my ears hearing Minister Lovell talk about those four-year programs and the connection to training and that more systemic and holistic sort of practice that's happening in the homelessness field. We have limited research and evidence available, and we do know, though, that there's a significant proportion experience major issues in the transitioning to independent living and have long-term negative outcomes. Again, this is telling you what you already know. We have had a cascade of reviews, and I've summarised them here really quickly. They are from the Burdekin Review in '89, and there were earlier ones before that, Carney, Fogarty, etc. But when care is not enough, in '99, Robyn Clark's work there, and Jane Morton and Peace, I think was a seminal piece that actually talked about the need to have an understanding of the mental health issues for these young people, and that shelter was not enough. And then we've had a whole host of others, as you can see there. And the themes I've tried to synthesise, because the learnings are fairly congruent, I think, in these reviews, and that is we need to have a focus on prevention and supporting children to remain at home with their families. has to have a child focus. We need to listen to the young person's voice about what they know matters. We have to respond assertively and proactively to prevent our young Aboriginal children coming into care, earlier family preservation work, etc. Kids with disability are overrepresented. We know roughly about a third of kids in our system would also meet that diagnosis for disability. We have to focus on the outcomes. And a key finding of the Cummins Review was actually that child protection can't do it on its own. I'm paraphrasing here. But there was a big call in that Cummins report for adult-focused services and other services that work with children, like education and health, to step up and work as a team across government. That to actually deliver what these kids need, and Bernie Geary says these kids deserve the gold card into other services, because they have experienced such horror often, such distress, such grief, such loss. It can break your heart. I was with a boy in Secure Welfare on Thursday, and he was 12. He'd had his 13th birthday in Secure. His mother died 18 months ago. His dad doesn't know where he is. He's got 4 other siblings. And he had his head on his table, and there was just this one slow tear. And he's absconded from placement so many times it's not funny, and we're worried sick about him, obviously. He's at enormous risk. And he said to me, I knew my last carer couldn't keep me. And I said, before that, you weren't running away, mate. What was happening? And he said, yeah, I really loved her. She was all right. I felt comfortable there, he said. I felt comfortable there. That was his word. And then I said, what happened? Because she wasn't leaving until the March, but you started running away much earlier. Did something else happen? And he said, no. He said, I knew she was going. I said, did you? He said, yeah. I said, the workers didn't realise that. He said, no. He said, I could hear her on the phone. I knew she had to leave the house. I saw her sort of packing bits on the side. And what did he do? He took into his own hands a solution, because he was sick of moving, and he was sick of no one really knowing him, and he was scared stiff. He felt actually safer sleeping rough. Yeah. So these sorts of reports that we've written, and resources there actually, are full of what I would be calling a trauma-informed approach, that we need to understand the heartache that's inside these kids and the trauma they've experienced, and what is a fairly predictable pattern if you understand that trauma framework. And, of course, an enormous focus on planning early to work with these kids. So what we've done in Victoria is a very holistic approach. It's not just saying we're working at the tertiary end with kids transitioning, although we've got to do that much better, obviously. But it's actually, what are we doing with the babies? What are we doing with the young parents? What are we doing with those kids who've exited out-of-home care who are now parents themselves? You know, how do we actually intervene earlier? Because if you understand the huge influx of knowledge from neuroscience, those early years in that brain development is a really important piece of evidence that we've got to integrate into our knowledge base. And that doesn't mean we shame people, because if the mother who's endured being battered by the violent partner, and we say, look, you know, the message has to be how we use this research, not to shame people, but to empower, so that she doesn't feel, as one woman said, you know, I felt such an idiot that I chose him, and I knew what people were thinking of me. And then I learnt this stuff about the brain development of my child, and I think, oh God, I've brain damaged my child. And it's like, no. How we use this information in a way that's helpful and empowering, that does speak about the rights of kids too. And that's the double-edged sword. We know that the adolescent period also, and I don't think this is celebrated enough, the research that's coming out now in the adolescent brain development field. You have an enormous window to make a difference. There's a huge surge of neurological change at that time. We know that trauma pattern is predictable, that memories are stored differently. If there's been trauma, the memory will be like a scrambled egg. It's not neatly stored away in intentional memory. Okay, it's much more right brain. It's not in language. Most of our memories are actually in a narrative, in a language base. For young people who've experienced trauma, and I guess the adults you're working with will have had a bucket load, right? A lot of their traumatic memories are actually in vivid images and sensations, much more right brain, which means they can be triggered off. They're not resolved, okay? There hasn't been a making of peace between the memory, the experience in the body, and the meaning they've made of it. And you see that played out because they're triggered, you know, and they're often acting in fight-flight response. And it was interesting hearing Rosanna's research around those people who move constantly. Often that running, you know, that absconding, if you like, for our young, that word that's around in the out-of-home care space, which we're using less of, because we're much more curious, rather than what's wrong with this kid or what's wrong with this parent, what's happened? What's happened to them? And if you really enter into what has happened to this young person or this child or this parent, a whole lot of other stuff makes sense. And you stop using words like emerging borderline personality disorder. What we talk about much more is complex post-traumatic stresses or symptoms that fit that, yeah? We have so many kids that have been misdiagnosed as having ADHD that in fact are having a very predictable presentation that follows being parented inside a battlefield where the people you love most in the whole world and you're drawn to attach, you're not drawn to safety, attachment is basic, are the ones that are hurting each other, and you're often in the middle and feeling powerless. So we know, if we understand that sort of trauma, what we're seeing often in the adult field is this being played out again and again. They're stuck in that unresolved space of internal agitation, of being overwhelmed, of not being able to think your way through because you're so head up and you're so distressed and you haven't got the words for it. Right? Speechless terror, unspeakable things. And who would get it anyway, and who would care, and I don't even know where to start. And that's why I take my hat off to you people, because you provide a safe base and a pair of ears to listen, and you, more than that, you help. You are doing something practical. And stability and housing is key. We know that certain times of the year will trigger them. Meeting certain people, a certain tone of voice, lots of things will trigger them that remind them of those unresolved memories. We've got to calmly acknowledge and say, no wonder you don't want to talk to me. I wouldn't want to talk to me. I'm from child protection. Why would you want to talk to me? Of course you wouldn't. No wonder you're angry and upset. Yeah, empathise with that. Inform them about their choices and strategies. Be upfront about your constraints too. If you're only going to be there the next week in the agency, tell them that. Nurture and providing care and emotional containment, and actually working to provide that safety plan. There's been a whole strategy that's being developed and a big plan now that's happening in Victoria following Cummins. And part of that is the senior consultation that's underway for the development of the out-of-home care plan. We've also got the Create report card that comes out each year, which I love Create. They're the peak body for young people in out-of-home care. And there I would encourage you to read that report card, because I think it's full of enormous wisdom. And the importance of young people being engaged in the planning to prevent them going into homelessness. Really quick hooks too, and I'm happy for you to have these slides on email, so don't worry, I'm going fast, I know. But the outcomes from Australian research is pretty sort of consistent, and that is that negative life outcomes, and approximately half will have periods of homelessness. We also know that approximately half will commit offences. So this is Osborne and Bromfield's research that they've pulled together to synthesise. We know that that unresolved anger and trauma is often underneath it, and also their history of instability in placement. We do the good news now. We, for the first time in that Act in 05-07, we actually had the leaving care legislation, okay, that upped the care age group to 21, okay, that leaving care transition. I'm going to skim this because the Act, this is what the legislation says, but it was pretty particular, you know. It talked about assistance with education and training. This is in legislation, counselling and support, etc. What have we done about that? Well, there have been 21 community service organisations now funded to provide post-care support, information and referral services, and the mentoring program is really important because it provides that relationship-based connection. And if there's one thing that the research internationally says in terms of outcomes, the single greatest determinant of a good outcome, be it in child protection, in psychotherapy, forget the model, that's less important. The single greatest determinant is the quality of the relationship the professional forms with the family. And so that is a really important thing to hold in mind when we're thinking about any program. Leaving care brokerage dollars are there now, but in a way that they didn't used to be, which is really important. The Springboard program commenced in April 2012, and that was actually a really important innovation because we knew we needed more particular support for kids exiting residential care. And I'll send out these details, you can read more about that. We've written lots around what do we have to do to help kids transition. And those areas that are in legislation and all these other reports are obviously part of what we're trying to do much more effectively. And so there's lots of lists and practice prompts and training that we're doing all over the place. The helpline is really important, the Leaving Care helpline, and that's something we didn't used to have. And just to finish, because I want you all to hear Suzanne, who's a wonderful speaker, who's coming up behind me. The Create report card, the one that's just come out, I think gave us a bit of hope. 90% of children and young people indicated that they felt safe and secure in placement, and 95% were able to nominate at least one significant adult who care about them and who believe they will be able to depend upon them throughout their childhood and adulthood. I found that incredibly hopeful. Studies of young people, and that was over 1,000 young kids they surveyed around the country, except for WA. Studies of young people, and I'm quoting here Judy Cashmore and Paxman. Studies of young people leaving care found that feeling safe and secure, and that there were people in their lives who loved them and they could depend on, was the strongest predictor of how well they were faring 4 or 5 years later. It was more important than stability in care per se. And feeling connected and having positive and reliable relationships are key human needs. And again, I take my hat off to you because that's what you're all about. Thank you.